Okay, hello everyone. So welcome back this week. We're going to be doing a little bit of background for our final project. That's going to be looking at the census data to track changes in neighborhood over time. But I think it's important before we get into the data science part to have a little bit better understanding of the reason why our project is so important and to tie in some of the academic literature on this topic. So when we talk about neighborhood change for our final project, we can also be uh, talking as a synonym for gentrification. And so today I want to give just a little bit of discussion on what is gentrification, what are its causes and effects, what are some of the concerns, particularly related to the issue of displacement, some policy tools used that could be that could help spur up gentrification, and then finally, just to give a little bit more visual intuition, we'll look at New York City, some of the neighborhoods in New York City as a case study. So gentrification is typically the catchword used for neighborhood change. Typically, it implies a change that can be economic, ethnic, racial, and there's often this view that gentrification will displace some of the poor people within the area that's gentrifying. And so what do we mean by gentrification? It's complicated social science phenomenon, but we can work with the following definition: the process of renewal and rebuilding. And this process of renewal will accompany some kind of an influx of the middle class or affluent people in society into initially the areas that were deteriorating or often poor. And as a result of this process, many of the poor people who were initially in these poor areas often get pushed out due to increase in demand for local amenities and pricing increases, and poorer households are no longer able to afford to live in that location that's gentrifying. So some of the things that tend to happen when communities gentrify is that the average income will generally increase, which we'll expect because of the richer types of individuals moving in, and coinciding the family size. On average, the average family size will also tend to decrease, since we know richer households tend to have fewer kids. So why does gentrification matter? Is it good? Is it bad? There's a lot of debates about this topic, and a lot of policies that are used to that have effects on this process. So we want to take a look at what some of the issues surrounding the debates are. So first, we'll get into some of the causes of gentrification. There's typically a combination of some of these factors, like increase in housing demand, combined often with a shortage of housing supply. Gentrification can also take place due to changing attitudes and lifestyles, demographic trends. So in the revitalized Detroit scene, you have a lot of very young, high educated individuals moving into typically inner city poor areas of Detroit in order to take advantage of some of the cool factor of living inside Detroit City. Some of these attitudes can be brought upon different segments of the population that leads to this gentrification. They want to get into these hot areas. There can also be gentrification due to change in job locations. If new businesses open up in areas that are typically poor to begin with, perhaps because it's cheaper for them to operate there, that might also attract new workers in search of employment opportunities. And there can also be a spatial diffusion effect where wealthy neighborhoods that are adjacent to poor neighborhoods, some of that wealth will cross boundaries and be invested into the poor area, and this can also encourage gentrification in these areas. So there's typically a combination of one or more of these issues at play, and you can see these issues themselves are extremely complicated. So studying gentrification and neighborhood change is not easy to do, even with the census data that we'll be using. So we often are have to rely on imperfect measurements or imperfect proxies to track neighborhood change. And so some of the clustering that we're learning to do, we're trying to overcome that shortage of perfect measurements and try to create our own measurement or our own index so that we can track neighborhood change and potentially visualize gentrification taking place. Okay, so what are some of the effects of gentrification? Oftentimes there's visceral responses, particularly from civil rights advocates or the poor residents in these areas themselves. And there's oftentimes a lot of anger among these individuals, often because many of these residents in these poor areas have had to live with subpar amenities, including very poor schools, high crime, lack of government stimulus, food deserts, things like this. And so there's a lot of anger as soon as you start having affluent or middle class people coming into the area. All of a sudden the amenities get better, but then the poor people can't afford to live there. So Spike Lee had a famous quote, why does it take an influx of white New Yorkers in the South Bronx and Harlem and Crown Heights and other areas for the facilities to get better? And so you can see the perception is often compounding ethnicity into other issues of economic status and affluency. So oftentimes these middle-class affluent new migrants coming in are often are white. And so there's a very strong racial composite to the perception of how gentrification takes place. So one of the biggest negative outcomes gentrification is this pushing out of poor, often ethnic minority and immigrant groups out of these areas that they've lived in. So this is one of the main negative outcomes. But there are a lot of benefits to gentrification. We have renewed housing investment, poverty elimination, typically decreases in crime, better access to retail services and better quality retail, a larger tax base, and other kinds of positive amenities that are typically good for its residents. So the issue of displacement of poor individuals in gentrifying areas really comes within a broader framework of, is all development good? And so what tends to happen is local city leaders, they want to encourage economic growth, economic development, so they incorporate a lot of different types of place-based stimulus packages where they'll direct certain amount of the tax base to help revitalizing poorer areas, building new parks, or giving tax breaks to new companies that locate in a particular area of their jurisdiction. And so the question is, will these public policies, often enacted by local leaders, have some unintended negative outcomes besides the expected positive economic development, economic growth outcome? So what typically tends to happen is when you have, for instance, a new enterprise zone, which is a place-based policy very popular across many different US jurisdictions, and even the federal government have implemented, is basically enterprise zone is essentially where local government leaders will highlight a particular geographical space or jurisdiction, typically that's underperforming, has a high concentration of poverty, and they will lend different types of tax breaks to firms or enterprises that move into that area. Their incentive is that they get a significant tax break. The problem with this is when you have a bunch of new firms coming in to take advantage of the tax break, this is going to increase the demand for the local amenities. New workers may be coming in, and this is going to increase the rents in the neighborhood. And as those rents for living, or even for local amenities like housing, food, and other types of local amenities, the prices will begin to increase over time. And this is how the lower families will eventually potentially be excluded from these local areas and be forced to move to other low income areas where they can afford the market rent. So the term displacement is often accompanied this issue of gentrification, and it's often the primary reason why gentrification is bad. But despite this, Negative outcome of gentrification. Most government leaders and academics still agree that community improvements are extremely important. We want to promote economic development, we want to promote economic growth, but there's just increased attention for specific policies to not only promote economic growth, but to also help to mitigate some of the negative effects, such as displacement among the poor residents in their jurisdiction. So there's a lot of different policies that governments can use, local or federal, can use to try to protect vulnerable groups in areas that are undergoing gentrification. On the demand side, governments can help lower moderate income households pay for the units where they're living. It could be rent control or rent regulation. There's primary federal tools like Section 8 vouchers, which is public housing provided to low-income households. There's also supply side, can look at lowering the cost, creating and maintaining new housing units, and also to incentivize builders to build affordable houses in these gentrifying areas. And there's different federal tools like the public housing authorities, low-income housing tax credit, and also tax-exempt bonds. So there's a lot of different policies that try to help reduce some of the likelihood that poor households will have to be displaced. So now, just to give a little bit better visual intuition of what gentrifying looks like, we can look at New York City case study in 3 different neighborhoods that are along different placements along the spectrum of what gentrification is. So the 3 neighborhoods are Chelsea, Harlem, and the South Bronx. Chelsea is considered to be gentrified. In the 60s, it was one of the poorest neighborhoods in New York City, but over the last 40 years or more, the neighborhood has changed into a mostly affluent area. Harlem is considered gentrifying, somewhere in between. Gentrified and poor. So in the 60s and 70s, again, Harlem had a lot of problems, high concentration of poverty, but since then has been revitalized in part through major government investments. And so the residents there over the last decade have increased anxiety and fear about being displaced as they've been seeing the local renting and prices increasing in that area. And then South Bronx is not quite gentrified or at the gentrifying stage. It's in the rebuilding and stabilizing period. So this is, again, one of the poorest areas in the 70s in New York City, and it's been mostly rebuilt. However, there's a large portion of low-income residents that are still there, and there's a major affordability crisis in the area. So if we're looking at Chelsea, it's this little tract labeled number 4 in New York City. Chelsea is now one of the richest areas in New York City. Some of the flats are sold for multi-million dollars. The median sale price is $1.3 million. And if we consider some of the complaints about areas that have become fully gentrified, one of the major issues is that there's just not enough affordable housing, or that all the public housing projects have been torn down and replaced with market demand housing. But that's not necessarily the case. So in Chelsea, for instance, there is still public housing and affordable housing that has been preserved through rent regulations. And any new market rate housing that's been built with 20% set aside for people making 40 to 50% of area median income. So there's still different types of policies to encourage new builds to have a particular share of occupancy that goes towards the low income families. So for our other case, other neighborhood is Harlem. Here is the number 10 on the track. It's literally right next door to Chelsea, and track number 4 there. So part of the reason why Harlem has seen rapid gentrification or rapid neighborhood change is due primarily to government investments. And these empowerment zones that I mentioned, enterprise zones that I mentioned before, is a federal place-based policy enacted in 1995, where it created a few different places in the U.S. to receive federal government spending, investments to encourage gentrification, to encourage economic development and growth. And coinciding with all the government investment, more people started to move in, and also more private investments also started to take place, coinciding with the public investments. Um, so there was a lot more investments and new retails coming to the area. At the same time, in the financial crisis, 2007, 2008, this area was hit pretty hard, and the land values plummeted. And there's been, to a certain extent, some recovery of those land prices, but there's still a long way to go relative to the pre-crisis level. And so we can see some of the public housing is still in existence in Harlem, but again, the concern is that there's not enough supply of affordable housing in these areas relative to the share of people who are low income. And as the prices continue to escalate, there is serious concerns that poor, vulnerable groups will be pushed out. And so some of the examples of gentrification, a lot of it is aesthetic improvements to the physical infrastructure. So the before and after, you can see the improvement of buildings being torn down and rebuilt or modified. Okay, and then South Bronx, this is track number 1, which is just south of Chelsea. Track number 4, also the neighboring Chelsea. So despite being so close to Chelsea, one of the richest areas, Bronx is considered to be one of the poorest areas, neighborhoods, or boroughs in New York City. It experienced a huge drop in population during the 70s, over 20%, and it still hasn't recovered since that time period. It's still one of the poorest areas. New York City has the highest percentage of public housing, rent regulation, and subsidized housing in all of New York City, and it has the lowest percentage of home ownership. So we consider this to be stable, South Bronx to be stabilizing, because there's still a lot of problems where the prices, the government spending, and private investments haven't got to the point where we're seeing rapid changes in the pricing and the rents. But there is some signs that the market rates are increasing over time. So there is definite optimism that economic growth will continue to take place, and then this will lead into gentrifying and neighborhood change. Okay, so we can just look at a few pictures here, the before and after. So here's Melrose Avenue, over 25 years completely rebuilt. Webster Avenue, between 2004 and 2005, has met aesthetic improvements. And then East 148th Street, we can see brand new apartment complex and new construction taking place. So this is just a very brief overview of what we mean by neighborhood change. And many times it's synonymous with gentrification, and gentrification is often synonymous with rapid changes in prices for housing, or rapid changes in the ethnic composition or the composition of economic, socioeconomic status, such as the average income. So these are a bunch of variables that we can use in the census, and we have been using in the census, to try to track neighborhood change. And for the final project, we'll be looking at how we can track this neighborhood change, what are the descriptive changes, and also what are potentially some of the issues that can take place with gentrification. Okay, so stay tuned for the next video.